The whole point of creating music is to give voice to things that aren't normally given voice to. And that's from Tom York. And with that, I would like to introduce our guest on today's episode of The Switch, Jean-Luc Sinclair. Jean-Luc, welcome to the podcast. Oh, you're muted.
And those are there are some big shoes to fill. By the way, it's not anybody to quote lightly, but thank you. That's a great quote, and I'm quite a fan of his work.
Yeah, same. So before we get into some of the ideas that we want to be talking about today, namely interactive audio and teaching and many of the offshoots of those topics, I want to get into some of your story. Who are you? As much as you'd like to explain about yourself, the way I typically ask people is if you could divide your life into epochs of where I am now and where I was then or where I was before, how did you make that journey?
Well, right now I am a professor at Berklee College of Music in Boston, although I live in New York City. And I'm also an adjunct professor at New York University. At Berklee, I teach in the electronic production and design department, which is essentially the electronic music and electronic sort of tinkerer division. And at NYU, I teach at the Steinhardt School in the music technology division. I'm also a composer, and I do consulting. I'm also an author. And how I got here is, well, I suppose as it is for everybody, it's a long story, but initially it was a love of computers and music that got me here very early on. And perhaps a childhood that was bathed in 8-bit video game consoles and very early fledgling technologies that combine all these magical things for me as a child: graphics, sound, and games, of course.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit more about where that started, because I'm interested in what are some of the influences that have affected you and made you who you are today. What are some of the things that got you interested in the topics of music and technology and really sold you on their importance in the world?
That happened, I think, as is often the case, almost by happenstance, by the circumstances of my life. I grew up in Paris in the early 80s, and my father worked for an Italian computer company called Olivetti, which used to make PCs and typewriters and scientific equipment. And he ran his own business with his associate and a couple of employees. And after school, I would often find myself sort of parked there. And to keep me quiet, they would put me in front of a computer. And at best, I think they were hoping I would just kind of, entertain myself in the nonsensical aspect of clicking and pointing on, clicking on keys and typing weird stuff. But ultimately, it turned out to be quite interesting to me because I found myself making music and graphics before I knew anything about music or graphics. I taught myself some BASIC when I was there. And now, if you're not familiar with BASIC, there's no reason that you should be these days unless you're an aficionado of old school computer languages. But that was part of it. At the same time that was going on, my mother really wanted me to learn the piano. So I said, initially I resisted it because I really liked computers and I felt that I could be perfectly happy typing at a computer all day. But eventually I was like, I do like music, but actually, if I could, I'd like to play the organ, the pipe organ, which was a surprise. And to me, the appeal was that I could play the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, which I loved. I've been as a child. And I loved the fact that even though I didn't know much about it, I knew you could change the sound of the instrument. And that was interesting to me. So it was sort of the intersection of these two things that eventually, years later, I was able to sort of put together and said, I think there's something there I'd like to dig into. Um, and it wasn't exactly the kind of things where you could go to your sort of local conservatory in Europe and say, hey, I'd like to study computer music, because they would be like, what? And at the same time, if you were a computer scientist, well, you couldn't be a serious musician because, well, that wasn't computer scientist material. At least back then. Obviously, we know now that that's not true. Some of the greatest advances in computer science or computer music and music have been done by people that straddled both. But at the time, there was still a fairly odd approach to it. I was just lucky enough that I found enough people in my family and outside to support me in sort of thinking like, yeah, maybe both of these odd, seemingly antithesis, sort of opposing endeavors could be interesting.
Did you have any mentors along that journey? Like, were there specific people that influenced you in moving through that space?
It took a while, but eventually I did. I remember like 4 years into my studies at the conservatory, and I must have been like 14, 13. Um, I had this professor who was quite an accomplished musician and composer. He turned out, he was a couple of years away from retirement, so this really was a way for him to kind of keep busy and to pass the time more so than the paycheck that he didn't really need. But he had at the time retired from working and touring with pretty big acts back in France. He toured with people like Edith Piaf and Django Reinhardt in the 50s and 60s. And so, he had sort of made his name on that, and got tired of touring, quite frankly. And so he felt that, a good way to still sort of keep a little bit of an income stream while not having to travel the world and deal with jet lag, at a time in his life where he wasn't so sure he still wanted to, was to teach. And it really was out of passion. That's been a theme for me, to find people that have taught out of conviction, out of passion. And I can't tell you how lucky I've been to find people that who got into teaching, not because it was an easy paycheck, because it never is actually, but because it really was something that they felt strongly about. And so his name was Monsieur Labadie, and if you Google him, there's not much about it, but you still find a couple of Edith Piaf songs that he wrote for her. But it just so happened that toward the end of his life, he had bought a DX7, which, if you're not familiar with what a DX7 is, one of the very early 1982, 1983 Yamaha synthesizer. And so he was fascinated by it. And I think it was more of a curiosity for him. And he, oh, by the way, incidentally, he hated Johann Sebastian Bach. So he had to teach me Bach, but he didn't like playing it. But he really liked making sound with his DX7. And somehow we found a connection there. We couldn't connect musically on everything, and I was okay. We were both fine with that. He could still teach me a lot, but somehow toward the end of his life, he got involved in technology and thought, hey, this is kind of neat. I can make sounds I've never played before. I should look into that. And me being quite young at the time, I was kind of, in a being a bit of a tech nerd, I was thrilled that there was a way to combine music and technology. So that was the first mentor I had. And that was pretty instrumental, of course.
What was your mindset like in terms of career and success in those days? Were you thinking, I'm going to become an accomplished computer scientist, I'm going to become an accomplished musician? Did you see where you've landed today as, yep, that's where I'm going? Or what were you thinking?
So that's it's always so difficult to with hindsight anyway, to ask a 10-year-old, a 14-year-old, or even an 18-year-old to know what that path is. And if you know what your path was back then, either of these stages in life, I think you're pretty lucky, um, because it's pretty rare. Uh, my it became pretty clear after a couple of years of studying music that whatever I was going to do in life had to do with music and technology. I did not know what that was yet. Um, I really had no idea, but I knew that that's what I wanted to do. Um, how, I had no idea.
Yeah. So, okay. So skipping forward a little bit. So I know you from going to Berklee College of Music. That's how you and I met. I took a bunch of your classes, and I felt like we had a strong teaching relationship. I learned a whole lot from you. But how did you end up in that position? Like, we're still. At what point did you come to the U.S.? Was it a back and forth thing? Like, what did your the next part of your life look like career wise?
So I came to the U.S. because it was there were opportunities to study music and technology in France, but the truth of the matter was at the time there were very few seats available, um, and um, and in order for me to get to any of these, I would have had to go through another 4 to 8 years of conservatory life. So I did about 9 years in France of going through the straight conservatory path, and and after high school, I didn't think that I wanted to do another 5 or 6 or 7 years just so I could study things that I was really interested. What I loved about the U.S. at the time, among other things, was the fact that there were starting to be programs that focused specifically on music and technology. And these programs, although they did exist in Europe, there were some in France, there were some in Germany. At the time, Germany, to be fair, was what they called, actually in Germany still to this day, the black hole, the sort of 80s after or 90s, when not that much actually came out of Germany in computer science and computer music, not sure it's computer science, and that changed very quickly after the 90s. Um, but there were a few places, some in Italy, some in France, some in England, um, but there weren't full-on university programs that started to dedicate themselves to the study of music and technology. So coming to the US felt like a pretty natural fit. This is where I can study the things that I know I want to study. And I was lucky enough to be able to identify some of the programs that could allow me to do that. So at the time, um, there were only so many programs in the US. There's more music technology programs today, although you'd be surprised, you'd think like there would be more to this day. Um, but there were a few that were emerging, and and I decided that this was what I wanted to do, and so it took a while to be able to make that happen for any number of reasons. Coming from different culture, of course, different country, the financial aspect, but somehow a lot of these things were able to fall into place. And the place that I went to study at initially is the place where I find myself teaching now after another 20 years of not being at Berklee, um, because Berklee at the time already had a music program that was heavily based on technology. And I was one of maybe the 3 in the US and perhaps um, North America that were to a point where you could see that there were real opportunities after the programs in terms of job prospect, in terms of professional opportunities.
were you were you thinking, like, if I just get good enough at this stuff that I'm interested in, the career aspect will find me? Or were you not even thinking that? You were just in into what you were into and tried to make it work? I'm
So
yeah, I'm really curious about the
no,
the philosophy
that's
of it.
that's a great question, because the truth of the matter is, even though in the back of my mind I knew that as I entered college or college age, um, shortly after, or within a couple of years of me entering college, I would have to sort of take care of myself. Um, it wasn't um, the initial impetus. I didn't think that what I was doing was suicidal in terms of career. Don't get me wrong. I didn't think that I'm doing this because that's what I want to do, and damn the torpedoes kind of thing. But it was more about I think that it felt to me at the time that there were going to be a number of opportunities that would develop over the years in this area. What they were, I wasn't sure. Why I felt there would be opportunities was, I suppose, because again, I grew up in sort of the 80s where, computer were becoming a thing that wasn't just for, science labs and universities, and music was changing too, to be fair. Music was starting to be produced differently. And I don't think that at the time I formulated that thought in my head. I'm like, well, I'm in a very interesting time for music and technology. It just was, no, I think there's something there. And there's always a little bit of luck involved in these, I think. And to me, I was lucky that in that regard, anyway, I wasn't completely off the mark, and there would prove to be some opportunities there. But it was not the initial impetus. The initial impetus was passion, to be fair.
Yeah. That makes sense. So what I've heard here and there, I think I've heard some of the opportunities you've had and career things that you've done. But why don't you talk us through some of those opportunities that reached you, and how those brought you to where you are?
Well, there were, when you look back, and I'm at a point in my life where I'm starting to be able to kind of look back, and I hope there's still things to look forward to, but there's definitely things to look, back at. And, I didn't know at the time when I started to work at my undergrad that what I would do ultimately would have that much to do with interactive audio. I felt that maybe it would have to do with music, maybe it would have to do with sound. But again, the prospects were a little bit blurry for me. What happened to me in 1994, 1995, so that dates me back, but I was still doing my undergrad back then, was that a friend of mine came up to me and said, hey, there is this gaming company in Boston, well, which is where we were, Cambridge actually, called Looking Glass Technology. And they do video games. I don't know if you're into this. And I was a gamer back then, to be fair, off and on anyway. I wouldn't call myself a hardcore gamer, but I grew up with video games, and it was always something that was part of my life. And I don't know if the term hardcore gamer applies, because I feel like that means, somebody who spent, a significant amount of their time just doing this. Or I've certainly done that at times of my life, but I was a gamer, and I was familiar with Looking Glass Technologies. In fact, in the world of gaming, there is slightly there's a bit of an aura around them. If you go back to the era of the 80s and 90s, they came up with some games that were very significant. One of them was called System Shock, which was sort of the first-person shooter before Doom that had the same type of experience that you would expect today from a first-person shooter or first-person game, where you can explore the world, you can look around. And yeah, at any rate, I was familiar with them, and I was like, oh, first of all, I had no idea they were in Boston or close to. And so I went to meet with them, and they were like, well, great, we're so glad you're here, because we need people to do audio editing and audio mixing. I think at the time they still called it digital audio mixing, which was interesting, because there was still a chasm between computer audio and I guess reel-to-reel audio, analog audio. And it just so happened that, of course, being from Paris, I spoke French, and they were like, well, we also have a number of games that we need to translate into French, so it'd be very helpful if the person who did the editing spoke French, which makes sense to me. And so they asked me if I wanted to do freelance for them. And that was a bit of a revelation at that point. I was like, I can absolutely myself doing this, or getting involved in that aspect of things for time to come. And when I look back, at sort of how things happen, there's again luck. network, knowing people that can get you there, um, and um, and hopefully some talent. But to put things in perspective, I just want to say that you have to assume that everybody that's going to apply for this type of position or any is going to have similar amounts of talent, maybe in slightly different ways. And so talent, I've found, is usually not enough to set you apart unless you're so far above the lot that you clearly stand out with no need for introduction. But of course, it's part of it. It's necessary. What I've found also that has been extremely helpful is a combination of these other two factors, which is networks of people that you know and luck. Now, luck you have very little control over. Talent, you have to assume that that most people applying for whatever position at that level of expertise that you're in will have a similar amount or level of talent. So it kind of comes down to your network, in my opinion. And that's the one thing you actually have control over. Who you meet, how you establish bridges with people, the relationship that you form. Of course, again, assuming that the talent can follow and that you're not finding yourself as the unluckiest human being in the world and all things happen to go against you. And that maybe was one of the first times that I realized that and how important all of these elements, luck, talent, and networks, were to your potential success.
Yeah. So how does that lead you to Berklee teaching today? What are some of the other steps along the way?
There were many. It's funny because I never felt or never thought of myself ever going back to Berklee to teach. It sort of happened in a number of course, sort of convoluted way that sort of take you back to a place where you maybe feel like you cannot belong in the end. If you're lucky enough, at least as I was, I think. Well, after I graduated from Berklee, I decided that I wanted to spend a year or two just working. I knew I wanted to get a master's. I wanted to further my studies. But before doing that, I really wanted to get some professional experience and hands-on. And so I did some work for a couple of companies that were doing video editing, interactive media. And mind you, at the time, interactive media was, CD-ROMs. And, that was very, very limited. But it was, the very onset of that technology. And that served me well because ultimately there would be more work in interactive media, of course, beyond CD-ROMs that would develop as what we think of today as pretty much entertainment. Most entertainment, to some extent these days, is offered through some kind of interactive format, even if it's just you clicking on a number of different shows and fast forwarding between episodes on Netflix. That is still far more interactive than TV was in the 1980s and in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. So this nonlinear approach served me well. But I then, after a couple of years in New York, doing a lot of work for a lot of freelance work, I went to Cal Arts, the California Institute of the Arts in LA. And at that point, I wanted to sort of refocus on music and sound design specifically. And I felt that maybe teaching would be an interesting option, not because I wanted to sort of feel completely safe and sheltered, but because I felt like it would give me time to research and experiment without the same amount of pressures that I had in some aspect of the private sector. Well, teaching is still private sector, but you know what I mean, in non-academia side. Now, that may or may not have been true at the time. I realize that now, but it was another impetus. And although I kind of felt like I would teach, the next thing that happened to me was nothing to do with that. After I graduated with my master's, a friend of mine called me and said, "Hey, I somehow got in touch with this artist that I can't tell you who it is, but they're working on a video game now, and I think it'd be great to help them out, but you have to send, I mean, at the time again, a CD, so they know a bit more about you. Um, and it sounded very mysterious. Um, it was an opportunity, it turned out, for me to work on the on the design on the ground floor of the game Doom 3. Um, and and I was at the time hired by ID Software, id Software, to work on sort of defining what the sound of Doom 3 would be, with an artist at the time that was Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails. And it kind of happened because, well, for a number of reasons, but not the least of which, it turns out, again, I'd like to think that there was, talent was one of the reasons that I ultimately got hired. Um, but whenever possible, I like to ask the people who hire me why they hire me. It's not always possible to sort of make that conversational leap, and make it seem totally casual. But whenever possible, if I thought I could get away with it, I would ask. And so in that case, I said, "Hey, Trent, you're, this is, the we're talking about late 90s, early 2000, actually 2000, 2001. I said, Trent, you're a pretty big deal in music right now, and I'm kind of curious as to why, how you came to hire me." And this is what he said to me. There were two things, apparently. One was that he said, "I got a lot of CDs, a lot of demos. Most of them were trying to sound like Nine Inch Nails. They were trying to sound like me." And his answer to that was, I don't need people to sound like me. I'm very good at sounding like me. So a lot of those, even though they may have been great, weren't super interesting to me. Yours was completely different. And what I had sent was a collection of ambient sound design that would span for 45 minutes if you wanted to. And I even remember thinking, this is kind of absurd. I'm just sending Trent Reznor 45 minutes of bizarre computer music ambience. But turned out that was one way to get noticed. The other thing that I even didn't think about was that when I sent what at the time was a CD, of course, I spent the time to print the labels on the outside and print the CD, so it looked somewhat professional, and you could see my name on the side of the CD. Now, just like you would on a on a book. Yeah, that's the book. But so you could see my name there. And Trent said, it's interesting because we got a lot of CDs, and the way that we would sort of sort them out, we would listen to one, and if we liked it, it would go on the top of the pile. If we didn't, it would go at the bottom of the pile. Well, yours was one of the few that we got that was fully printed. And so when we looked at the pile, your name kept coming up. And you could always see where yours was in relation to others that were not printed. We didn't spend the time to do this. And after a while, it was like, well, maybe we should give this guy a call. I've been looking at his name for 3 weeks now. Let's see what happens. And I remember actually spending the time, and again, back then, talking about LA in 2001, maybe, I had to go to Staples to print out stuff and to buy labels and to make the design. It took about a half a day to a day to get those labels printed the way I wanted to. And I at the time felt, this is kind of silly. Why am I taking all this time printing a label? But turns out that actually did make a difference. And what I didn't realize at the time was that your first impression is so important, and your first impression is increasingly less and less an in-person impression. And so that was another one of those moments where I got invited to work in New Orleans at the time. The studio is now in LA, but at the time was in New Orleans. And we spent about 3 to 4 months sort of designing the identity of the game so it could be handed off to somebody else. And said, this is what we came up with. This is the demo. It was shown at the E3 trade show. I remember there was a giant banner outside that said Doom 3, and we're all very impressed. And sort of hoping that we weren't going to be found out because we all had imposter syndrome. Like, are we really good enough for this? Including Trent Reznor, by the way. He also had imposter syndrome. I just want to point that out. So it happens to the best of us. And that opened some doors for me, of course. That relationship, the game was taken away from them, and it got handed off to somebody else. But what happened later on is that that gave me a bit more credence on top of the other projects I had done. Fast forward to 2006, 2007, NYU was trying to put together or wanted to put together a game audio class. And I had at the time, I suppose my name had sort of floated around because one of my former professors at Berklee, who is still a mentor of mine, Dr. Boulanger, was teaching a class at NYU and said, hey, you should give this guy a call, see what happens. I don't think there was much more than just that, and that was enough to get me in the door and to have a conversation. And I got handed a graduate class. I mean, I had taught before, but I got lucky because I taught for 5 or 6 years, and it takes a bit more than that to know how to teach. We all have to do it. You have to start somewhere. But one of the things that I think with hindsight was my initial instinct was correct with that, the intersection of computer and sound would indeed provide me with opportunities further down the road. And it turned out that certainly back then, and I mean, it's not that far off, but, we're talking about 13, 14 years ago, there were not that many people that could sort of coexist or thrive within an academic environment, but also had experience that they could bring into the realm of interactive audio, specifically game audio. And that's where I was, after teaching a couple of those classes, I felt that, I actually like teaching. I mean, I thought I would, but no, I know I do. So I should pursue this further. And I did. And then years later, fast forwarding, I got a call from Berklee saying, hey, your name was brought up again by somebody else that you might know. And we thought maybe you would be interested in applying for a job here. And that person that had brought up my name wasn't, again, Dr. Boulanger, but he was able to do it with confidence because I had been teaching at NYU for some time. And his initial comment was like, well, which he had made, back 15 years ago, 14 years ago, was give this person a call. Now he had a little bit more of a leg to stand on. And of course, you still have to, once you're there, prove your worth, quote unquote. But that was the path, the very, very long-winded path, and that took me to teaching and to be at places I feel very lucky to be at. I teach at the graduate program at NYU in music technology, which I'm very happy about. And obviously, Berklee College of Music is well renowned. So that turned out to be very rewarding for me.
Yeah. So I want to get to your teaching philosophy. I want to hear about how you convey these topics to students, but I want to take a quick trip first into definition land. Can we just give an overview of interactive audio? Like what when you're talking about interactive audio, what do you mean, and what's the significant difference between that and just learning to be a musician who can play synthesizers?
So I'm glad you did, because I sometimes take for granted the topic that I spend most of my days teaching. So maybe before we define interactive audio, let's define non-interactive audio. And that would be what you watch on TV, in movies, on Netflix. You may enjoy a given movie. Maybe you've seen some of the Star Wars franchise movies 50 or 100 times, and certainly a lot of people have, and I might be in that category, to be fair, if I'm being perfectly honest. But
Alex too.
but but the fact of the matter is, you might watch this movie 100 times, but it never changes. You know exactly what's happening, you know when it's happening, and that's part of the fun, to be fair. You know, you're expecting these moments, you're anticipating them, you're looking for things that you didn't notice before that you might have noticed anyway. But so that would be, let's call it linear audio. And that's how, you know, since we've really got started with radio production in the 20s, audio has been. You produce a portion of media, audio in our case, and you spend as much effort and attention as you can to make that as pristine and engaging as you can. But you know full well that just like a regular piece of music, like a composition, it will play from beginning to finish in the same way every time. Now, that worked very well for a lot of the media that we had up until video games got thrown into the mix. And that really changed everything. Now, you know, you don't need to be a video game expert to know Pong, the 1972 Atari game. There's a number of reasons why Pong is interesting to me. One, it's the first runaway success in an industry that was, up until then, not an industry. It was, I mean, I said it with all due respect and actually admiration. It was pioneering computer nerds that were bored. And then between assignments on their computer time, would come up with ways to pass the time and sort of make these little games, right? And there was no industry behind it. It stemmed from the genius of a few individuals at MIT and at Stanford and at Princeton, and other places. But those are the places that we can definitely pinpoint with accuracy today. So, so what happened then is that, well, these early video games, first of all, they were called that, but they had no sound. None of these people, as intelligent, as smart, and genius as they may have been, had any audio production background, but also none of these computers could actually output audio. I mean, you know, it took a while until we had an actual computer or even gaming console with an audio output that said, hey, you can plug this into your speakers and you hear something, and what a concept. So, but as soon as the sort of what's known as the second or sometimes third generation of gaming consoles, and by that I mean, if you can remember, well, if you were alive and a child when the Atari 2600 console was released, we're talking 78, 79, all the way to the mid 80s. In fact, it was sold, I believe, until the early 90s, the very early 90s, which is really, really spectacular in terms of lifespan. Well, what you'd remember is that you were so thrilled by the fact that you could control pixels on a screen, that even if the sound wasn't that great, it wasn't a big deal initially. And even if the pixels really looked like pixels and were very blocky, it also wasn't that big of a deal. The appeal of the technology itself was such that you were willing to look past all of the flaws. But sure enough, eventually people started to think about, well, okay, now we've been making these games for a while. Maybe we should spend some attention to sound. And the problem was at the time that we could not recreate sounds digitally, meaning you could not record a sound and play it back on a computer with the average hardware that somebody could afford that was not a computer scientist. So all the sounds of these early video games was created by these small onboard synthesizers. They weren't very good. They certainly are charming to this day even, but they weren't very good. And so the initial approach to interactive sound for most people was this idea that if you could control something on the screen, it had to sound really bad and cheesy. But thankfully, people kept sort of digging into this area. I think like, no, I know graphics are important, and obviously we all want better graphics, but what about better audio? And so through the 80s and the 90s, we saw a sort of group of pioneers that, in spite of the fact that there was very little respect and very little glory to be gained in the world of computer audio or interactive audio or game audio back then, they still kind of said, no, 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 there's something there. I want to keep at it. And, yeah, it may not sound great today, but they knew it would sound better eventually. Now, interactive audio means that the actions that you take have a audio cue in response that's appropriate to that action and that will change every time. So now we're no longer talking about a movie where you know exactly the order and the timing of every sound in this film from start to finish. We're talking about something which is completely interactive or very interactive, where it's impossible to predict the order through which the sounds will occur. And so you have to now somehow come up with this system that will sound appropriate. If something positive happens, you hear a nice sound. Something negative happens, you hear a less nice sound. But also something that is able to keep up with the level of quality that we see in the graphics, that we see in the gameplay, and that enhances that. And what I think that we've done is not only be able to match the visuals eventually, and we're still working on that to some extent. We can get into that later, but also create a new art form. And that art form is that your sound needs to adapt to your actions. It shouldn't be something which is set in stone. And there's place for that. There's room for that, and there's an art to that. Do not get me wrong, but there is another art form that has emerged, and that art form is your sound, your audio, your music needs to establish a dialogue with you. You're in control of that dialogue, and maybe not always. Sometimes the game is in control of that dialogue, but whatever or whoever is in control of it, we need to be able to provide the user audio or oral feedback that not only entertains but informs them. And that was the revolution. This double edge of entertaining and informing. Hey, you should look over there. There is a pickup there that will help you play the game a little bit longer. Or do not go over there. There's people shooting and they're probably bad guys. That is something that was new. And that we're still, I think, to be honest, barely just coming to terms with as a culture, and saying like, okay, no, I think I get it. Now this is how we should approach this. Because to be fair, I think even up until like a decade ago, it was kind of a free for all. Everybody had their own sort of method and techniques, and we're just slowly starting to codify that. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the only thing that I'm thinking now is, and I know somewhat of the answer to this, but I've never thought about it in explicit terms. What are the capabilities and understandings you have to juggle those worlds? Because you're no longer simply trying to make a visual, cue somebody and make it sound right. Like, you're talking about the audio technology, to both compose and I'll let you take it. Go ahead.
No, Chase, you that's actually a great point. Now, I know that you're familiar with the issues, but this is kind of the crux of the matter as an educator right now. What are the skills? To be fair, there are many. And now, I'm sure that most people here have heard the expression sound guy. Now, nobody would use that term now, because we all know that what that may have been true 20, 30 years ago, hopefully, and thankfully, there's more diversity in our industry now. And we know, certainly, my experience, for instance, doing working at NYU, I was part of the undergrad admission process for a few years. And what we noticed when we made a conscious effort to include more diverse student body was that the level improved. And that was not something that was subtle. It was very clear. So if you don't mind the fact that there is a little bit of an exclusion in the term sound guy, which obviously there is, it doesn't matter. We've heard that term. Now we would say sound person, and that's much more accurate. But whether it's sound guy or sound person, that assumes one human being is sitting at a desk in front of a computer doing the sound, whatever that is, right? Now, the sound is everything that comes out of speakers, right? So whatever is supposed to come out of that membrane behind me, whether it's music, dialogue, sound effects, narration, let the sound person do it. Well, that is changing. Very much like when you look back at how early video games were made, it was one person programming the entire thing. We no longer do that. No major game studio today would say, hey, we're going to put a major release. We should put one person in charge of everything. Right? That would make no sense. Now, back in the 70s and early 80s, it usually was one person. And that changed because the level of knowledge, technical savviness, and expertise that you needed to put a game increased so quickly that no longer could a single person manage it all. But in the audio side of things, we kind of kept to that model for a very, very, very long time. And in fact, even today, if you look at the sort of division that happened in the audio side of things in gaming studios, there are maybe two or three. There's the technical people that will sort of, program the code for the sounds to be played at the right time. They're known as the implementation people. There are the sort of more artistic side of things, the people that will create the sounds, that will design the ambiances, that will write the music. And maybe another further distinction between music and sound design, people that compose music and people that make sounds. Well, it's increasingly less and less feasible for a single person in our field, in the field of sound, at that level, to be able to have that much technical knowledge and artistic knowledge that they can do all of it. So maybe we can take one step back from your question, and that question would be, what are the skills that you need when you want to sort of focus on one area of interactive audio? Because they've definitely split up in the past few years. You may be familiar with a company called Magic Leap. Magic Leap makes augmented reality technology. You put on headsets and you look at your living room, but all of a sudden, some magical creature might just jump into your living room and sit on the couch next to you. That is the kind of technology they provide. Anastasia Devana is one of their audio leads, and she's given a couple of talks over the past few years about the fragmentation of the audio production side, how this model of the sound person no longer applies. Now, that may have still been feasible where your main job was to compose music, deliver music, create sounds, deliver sounds, even though if you've studied this, you know that they actually are separate skills as you do. And of course, while one person may be able to master both, it's just also difficult to make enough time in the day to be able to deliver both. So most people tend to focus. But one of the things that we see now is the fact that we are no longer satisfied with this. We want better sound. It doesn't matter if the sound is generated in real time or not. It should sound, your game should sound like a Hollywood movie or like a blockbuster movie, whether it's from Hollywood or elsewhere for that matter. And if you don't have that, if you do not meet that level of expectation, people are going to be disappointed.
Mm.
And they may not always express satisfaction with your work, but they will certainly express dissatisfaction with your work. And when you're comparing now the level of technical knowledge that's required to interface with a team of programmers, with a team of animators, of graphic artists, of producers, and also the level of technical know-how that you need to be able to integrate your work within a modern video game, it turns out that we are starting to see a fragmentation on the audio side of things as well. And now you have people that tend to focus more on, say, 3D sound. Now I'm assuming that most of us on this call are wearing headphones, and if you're not wearing headphones, you probably have been at some point on a Zoom call or while gaming. And headphones are rapidly becoming the premier delivery system for audio. Now, again, this is not a judgment, by the way, of whether it's good or bad. I'm just stating the fact. Most people listen to sound through headphones. Yeah, people still have 5.1 system and speakers, but mostly we're dealing with headphones. Well, the great thing about headphones is that, well, they're cheaper than buying, 6 speakers and a power amplifier, and they don't take as much space and it's faster. But it turns out that we can develop technologies to have 3D audio, right? And so 3D sound is becoming a real thing. Now, there are people that specialize just in 3D audio. How do you take a human being with 2 ears, a pair of headphones, and somehow make it sound like, or make it appear that sounds are coming from every and any possible direction around them, up, down, left, side, front, back? There are people that will and that continue to specialize in sound design. What we're starting to see that's new is that there are people that are now audio programmers or audio implementation people. There are men and women that focus on taking audio assets, sounds, and music, and making sure that they're triggered at the best possible time in the best possible way. It sounds simple enough when you put it that way, but by the way, so is playing the piano. There's white and there's black keys. You just have to press the right one at the right time and you're gold. So when you put it like that, everything sounds easy. That's also very new. Now, again, this is where you kind of go back on your own history and say, like, okay, what are the people that kind of helped me with this? I was very lucky when I was at CalArts to learn from a number of great people, but one of them was Tom Erb. He's not UCSD, I believe. Tom Erb, if you're in the audio world, you may be familiar with him. He has done quite a bit of audio software releases, hardware releases, and has been active since the mid-'80s on that scene. And he was perhaps one of the first person that I met in, quote unquote, the flesh, that was as much an expert in computer science, or it seemed to me back at the time anyway, as he was an expert in audio and sound. And what that made me realize again is that intersection of the two skills was quite rare, because his skills were very, very unique, and they still are. Obviously, just being a great educator that he is a skill in of itself. But his software release track just speaks for itself. Now, when I was looking back at learning programming for interactive audio, he was my professor, one of my main professors in grad school, certainly. And that's when I started to realize that, again, like, oh, now I can actually start to see actual applications for what these technologies that I love, that I wasn't quite sure they would fit together, but now I can start to see a path. And grad school was the first time where I saw that path.
Yeah. So, and I would even include in the domain of knowledge in the production team, not just production person, things like physics and psychology, because
Absolutely.
maybe you can talk about some of the ways that you've implemented those fields in your work, but I can speak from personal experience that even in trying to develop some of the projects that we've done with Mojo Filter Media, I've needed my math and physics skills a whole lot. The audio implementation job that you were talking about, that's my specialty. That's what I love to excel at and get better at. But I have to be able to wear many hats.
Mm-hmm.
And the psychology aspect as well, being able to make sure that you understand psychologically what are you delivering
Mm-hmm.
in sound design, being able to understand what are the actual impacts on somebody, and what they're thinking and feeling when they're interacting with your work.
Well, this is where things get interesting now, because when you're talking about the ability to implement audio that responds in real time to an action, um, you start to look at the technologies that we have at our disposal right now, and you realize that they are limited. Um, so if I take a glass of water and I tap it with my pencil a couple of times, there's nothing spectacular there, except for the fact that even though these sounds may have appeared to be the exact same sound, they're not. There's an infinite number of variations based on the velocity of the pencil hitting the glass, where I hit the glass, and where the water was in relation to the glass. Anyway, they're very similar, but they're not identical. Now, that wasn't an issue until we started to have another level of interactivity in games, which was real physics. And that's where implementation got really tricky. Certainly where our level of technological expertise had to jump up, and probably still needs to jump up a couple of steps. The reason I bring this up is because I think that's a good illustration of how involved and in-depth some of these topics have become, even though I don't think anybody back then, when you're talking about, like maybe starting to add sound to a video game in the early or mid 70s, had any idea of what they were really getting into, and they would have had to be pretty prescient to do that. Now, the issue is when you start to be able to interact with sounds, you realize that when you start to be able to interact with objects, you realize that most objects can make a lot of different sounds. Now, when you download a game, when you stream a game, there is a limited, finite amount of data that game contains. That amount is greater and greater every generation, by the way, but it's still finite. And then you start to realize that the more you're able to interact with the environment that you are in, and that's especially true with VR, where the expectation of interactivity are much, much higher than they were in non-VR environment. You start to realize that the technology that we've been relying on since the 80s, which, I mean, it's actually pretty much, I'm not exaggerating when I said we've been relying on similar technology since the 80s or mid 80s, are really a problem. What I mean by that is since the 80s, we've moved away from having little onboard sound chips in every gaming console to recordings, to actually being able to play back recordings of a sound. So that's great. An explosion sounds like an explosion. A car sounds like a car. It doesn't sound like some bizarre sort of 8-bit-esque version of that object. So we've gained a lot in realism. What we've lost, however, is the ability to interact with that object sonically. If you use recordings, a recording is a frozen vision of a sound in time. You can try to make that frozen recording come to life the same way that you can manipulate still images to make them come to life. But there's only so far you can take that. Now, that becomes more obvious when you start to say, hey, I can take this object and I can throw it around and it can bounce around this room against this surface, which is cement, and that's wood, and that's glass. And I don't know how hard it's going to bounce against all of these different surfaces or what angle and so forth. Now, that's when you start to realize that, boy, are we behind in sound compared to other technologies, which can do this without any problem. You can model pretty much any object today using computer graphics, make it photorealistic or very close, and make it behave in pretty much the same way that you would expect it to behave in the real world. That is still not the case with sound. Um, that is a new approach to sound design known as procedural audio, which which has been a topic close to my heart for quite some years now. That approach is actually, in many ways, going back to the first generation of online gaming console and saying, you know what, recordings are great and they're not going to go away. However, if I can pick up an object, move it around, shuffle it, throw it on the ground, that object needs to give me more audio than a recording can provide me. Now, even if you had, by the way, unlimited number of memory, that you could store every possible sound in the universe that object could make, do you really want to take all of that time to come up with hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of variation of how an oil tank can sound when going down a flight of stairs? That might not be the best use of your time. You know, that would be a waste, quite literally. So what we need to do then is clearly be able to not just rely on recording, but find a way to, using physics, just like it happens in the real world, recreate how that object behaves. That's becoming more and more pressing as an issue in game audio. That's one of the areas where implementation, physics, math, science start to intersect more. Not to mention that if you just want to even play a simple recording in most game engines, you will need to know at least 1 or 2 lines of code. But that's just to do something very simple. Now, if you're talking about what I'm discussing now, this area of procedural audio, that requires a hell of a lot more than just learning how to put together a couple lines of scripting. I think that ultimately procedural audio will become a specialty. In fact, don't take my word for it. Apple regularly has openings now for procedural audio sound designer. That's very new. Like 5 years ago, you didn't see any of those. Now I've noticed that every 6 to 8 months, a couple of openings on their website pops up for people that have that specific skill. So it's increasingly more and more demanding to do this on the technical side for sure. But even if you're not on the technical side, you still have to understand how to deliver these assets, how to create the proper sound, how to create a model. And as you pointed out, you know, interactive audio means that you are going to be having conversation with pretty much everyone at that production team. What I mean by that is if you do animation, for the most part, and I certainly don't mean to take anything away from the talent of animators, do not get me wrong, but most animators work within the graphics department. They have some contacts with programming. Mostly, that's it. Now, you're doing sound, you have to do sound for animations, for graphics. You have to answer to create sounds for AI characters. You have to deal with the programming team. So you have to have a breadth of knowledge, which is actually quite vast. And, you know, this is interesting to me because 15 years ago, 20 years ago, you know, even after 10 to 15 years in a company, on the audio side of things and in the interactive side of media, there was not that much money in it. But that changed in the mid 2000s, where people were starting to realize that actually we probably want to have very smart, specialized people and want to retain them. And then you start to see people that, you know, had after like 6 to 10 years in the company were making salaries that were very close to those of the highest paid people in the companies, programmers, producers, and so forth. And I would assume, I would even say that the smart companies even were faster at recognizing that need. Now that gets me to your point of psychology. When you have to deal with so many people, you have to be a bit of a diplomat. So whether it's psychology or diplomacy or a combination of the two, which I think ultimately is what you need, that in itself is a skill. Absolutely.
I'm curious about the effects, kind of going back to what you said about the division of labor almost being more separated and more focused. Do you think that's going to help, or actually, I wanted to ask, what impact on creativity do you think that has? And are there kind of safeguards that companies put in place, kind of talking about what you're saying now, needing to be diplomatic and understand working with people? Is it harder to get a higher paid, larger group of people to agree to more risky types of, um, trials?
That's a very good point, actually, because there is a bit of a catch-22 built in there. So you have, let's say that you are running a major game studio, you have a lot of expenses, you have a lot of employees that cost you a lot of money, but are very qualified. Now, you're starting to see that there are new technologies on the horizon. And integrating these technologies in your current workflow is going to be a destructive process. There's not going to be a lot of ways to do that very smoothly. You're going to have to get new positions, find how these positions fit in the current workflow that you had, deal with all the politics of having new people that say, hey, I know you used to design sound for all of these objects, but now this person will do that. You can do something else. All of that stuff gets into play. Not to mention, by the way, that there's also the inherent sense of feeling threatened when a company hires somebody whose skills are quote unquote newer than yours at these new things. So if you've been doing sound design and you're an expert and you're brilliant at how you do, but you're working in a specific way, and somebody says, hey, we're going to give this person a shot. They work in a completely different way. I'm sure you'll welcome them and everything will be fine. Well, I mean, hopefully, but usually things get more complicated than that. Now, different companies have different cultures, and ultimately, I think when it comes to communication, the culture of the company is the most important. And some companies make no qualms about the fact that they take pride, in fact, in having their employees work 100 hours a week for 6 months at a time. We call that crunch time in the game industry, and I think the companies that do this at their own detriment. It sounds to me that, of course, for sometimes you're going to have to say, you know what, I'm not going to get much sleep tonight. This has to happen, and it has to happen tomorrow, period. But if you find yourself in a situation when you're constantly running against that hurdle, you might wonder if there's not a more structural problem that keeps leading you back to the same position. Or perhaps in more, or in less diplomatic term, maybe you have a bit of an exploitative streak in your business. And, and to be fair, I actually think that's a fair point to make about any industry where people come into it as a vocation. I think that when there's a vocation, there will be people to take advantage of that. Hopefully not too many, but people will say, hey, you really like to do this, don't you? Great. What about doing it for free for a while, right? You like to do it anyway. And, that's, again, there's, I'm not saying that model is completely to be thrown away. There's something great about being given the opportunity to learn in a professional environment. You're not getting paid, but you're picking up a ton of skills. Yes, that I see value in that. But I feel like perhaps in the gaming industry overall, we've come to rely on that a little too much. In terms of the diplomacy of it all, how do you integrate somebody with a brand new skill set that's going to clearly make some waves? That's tricky. It also comes down to economics. Like, how long is this going to take me to get my department back in shape once I open that door? And I can't throw it back. I can put it back in the box. When it's out of the box, it's out of the box. And so I've spoken with a number of studios that are where the audio leads are very interested in some of these new technology and very interested in being able to work with people with skill set is increasingly specialized. But the problem that they're running into is quite simply the disruption that it would cost. to their workflow, to their deadline, and potentially the political blowback that they could get from that. Now, that's why I think that, if you find yourself in a position like this today, where you have I have these skills, and maybe I didn't think about it, but come to think of it, it could be threatening to some people. How you find a place to make those skills, sort of come to life, and find a place that will give you the opportunity to make the most out of this. That is a very tricky thing, and it comes down to, I think, meeting the right people.
Like you said in the beginning, network,
exactly. It comes down to networking, making it known that that's what you're doing, and then finding the people to give you that chance.
Yeah. How do you, I want to go to teaching a little bit. What do you think are some of the most important principles about your approach to teaching students these complex subjects? How do you approach that?
Carefully.
Yeah.
No, I'd like to think that the first thing to remember is that these concepts may be complex, may be complicated at times even, but they are not outside of the grasp of the very, very vast majority of people. Certainly not people that come to me at this point in their career, in their academic career, I should say. So if there are issues with it, the issues in making the concepts clear, the first person, I think, that's responsible is the person teaching the concepts. And so if the concepts aren't clear, even though some of these concepts can take time to sink in, even under the best of circumstances, if after a while they're not clear, then you have to reassess your approach. And by the way, that's no different from how I would approach, in a way, mixing music or designing sounds or implementing sound. If something isn't working after a while, well, maybe it's not the tools, maybe it's you. The other thing is, I am very fortunate insofar that what I teach is vocational for the most part. So if you come to me, you didn't think to yourself, hey, maybe this is a good career plan. You clearly wanted this at some point in your life. And so what that means then is, it is then my job to find out why somebody felt that you were good enough to be in that particular school and in that particular department, and what makes you good enough, and find out what those skills are and bring them out. And that's different for everyone. Now, that's the tricky bit, because it's very easy to teach to the middle. And certainly I think that there are many times where I can look back at my own teaching career and say, I should have done this at that point, or I should have done that. However, I would like to think that Nikola Tesla is one of my heroes. Speaking of heroes, there's a quote by him that I love. He said, "Comparison is violence toward the self." I might be paraphrasing, but the main idea is, when you compare yourself to others, the only person that you're hurting is yourself. Now, of course, that doesn't mean to say, and I'm sure that he would make the point, that you should, something, if you run into something or you hear somebody's work and that's great, you shouldn't be like, oh, well, that's their way. No, you should learn and find out what they did. But that is their process. Maybe there is something that you can bring into your process, but that doesn't mean that their method will work for you, for any number of reasons. So the other aspect of teaching to me is to find what makes somebody tick, and where it is that you can make that point of connection between the topic that you have to teach and that person's interest. And sometimes there may not be a lot there. I mean, sometimes people have to take a class because they have to take it, and that's that, and that's okay. I still think that even if you didn't really want to take the class, and maybe we didn't connect as much as we could have, you're better off having taken the class than not having taken the class. Now, when it comes to areas where there's more more connection that can be made, which usually happens in the upper classes in college, like undergrad, certainly level 3 and level 4 classes. And I would argue, hopefully, in any graduate level. Well, then your job as an educator really becomes to say, okay, what is that person's talent or talents? How do they shine? And how do I just tap that aspect of their personality and connect it to what I'm trying to show them? And it takes time. The truth is, it takes time, and it's usually done over more than one class. You can start to get there after a semester with a student, but there is benefit in working with some students for more than a semester, because sometimes it's very obvious very early on. Sometimes it takes a minute. But that, hopefully, is your job. And the last thing I would mention that I hope goes without saying for anybody considering teaching is passion. I hope that you're passionate about what you're teaching. And so in my case, it's easy. I think you can probably tell by the amount of time I've been speaking over the past 80 minutes or so that I'm passionate about this. But making the connection, that's where, honestly, that's, some people sometimes say, pilots make their money when they land and take off. I feel like as a educator, you make your money when you make that connection. Like going over a syllabus, that's easy. Regurgitating knowledge, there's not that much to that. Making the connection, now there's an art to that, and I'm certainly not saying I've mastered it, but I'd like to get better at it.
Yeah. I want to wrap up. I have one more question for you, and then we'll move to the off topic. And
please,
if anybody does have any questions for Jean-Luc, feel free to stick them in the chat. We can hit them at the end. What's the biggest thing that your mind has changed on since you started your journey, whether you want to take that from your journey professionally or your journey teaching? What stands out to you as like a big mind change moment?
That is a tough question. Now, the sort of I was going to say an almost knee-jerk reaction to that question is, the more you know that there's more to be known still. Your quest for knowledge only highlights how much you don't know. And you cannot let that paralyze you. You cannot let that be like, oh, I know all this stuff, but I realize there's all this other stuff I didn't know. Well, that may be the case, but whatever it is that you're studying, it should not let you should not let that stop you from doing. What you would hope it would do ultimately is make you humble, and make you realize that we are all going to make mistakes, that it's easy to become complacent in our views. It's easy to become complacent in our ways. I mean, certainly I do love many things about academia. The one thing that I'm always trying to be wary of is complacency. When you teach something for a period of time, 5, 10, 15, 20 or more years, the risk for complacency increases exponentially. Now, you would hope that the people that, again, are on the other side of the classroom behind the desk also question themselves on a regular basis, not doubt themselves, but question themselves. I mean, doubt is okay at times, by the way, don't get me wrong, but the idea is that, every so often, by every so often, I probably mean a couple of times a semester, and on some level, a student will point something out to me that I either had never considered, or that I actually may have been flat out wrong about. It may not be a student, it may be a client. It may come through different ways, but there is this. It is a constant quest, and that seems clear. And that quest means that I've been wrong in the past, I'll be wrong again. I'm okay with that, as long as I'm able to acknowledge that I've been wrong in the past. And that takes a little bit of putting your sort of big boy pants on and say, hey, you know what, that was a mistake. But the alternative is to not acknowledge any mistake and just keep making the same mistakes over and over again, which is clearly not an alternative.
Right.
So, yeah, it's but that's also what keeps it interesting, to be fair, and exciting.
Alex, anything else?
Just kind of going back to what you just said, are there any specific practices or techniques you have to make sure that you're not getting, like stagnating or kind of losing your ability to learn?
Again, very, very good question. Well, okay, so if you have an open mind and you're, or even if you're just mildly receptive, I think that happens through teaching, because you're looking at people that come at this with a fresh perspective, that are obviously have some talent in that area, and while they may need training in certain areas, their instincts alone may be enough to sometimes just kind of blow your mind. And I would say that, honestly, like, listening to your students, and that sounds cheesy, but it really isn't meant to, is a good way to do that. The other, I find, is to not sort of let yourself be enclosed in a specific sort of feedback loop of, these are the books that I use, and this is the videos that I use, and this is the software I use, and be open to, like, once in a while say, I'm going to take my syllabus for this class and I'm going to just trash it and start from scratch. Now, in gaming, game audio, but gaming, well, anything with technology, you're going to have to do that on a regular basis anyway, because, well, sometimes I am jealous of people that teach counterpoint. Not because I want to teach counterpoint. Now, if you're not familiar with counterpoint, that's the area of music which focuses on layering melodic lines against each other. But the reason that sometimes I might get a little jealous of people teaching counterpoint is that it hasn't changed in 200 years. And we teach counterpoint today just very similarly to the way that we taught counterpoint, 100 years ago. 150 years ago. I can't think of that being true in technology in any way, shape, or form. So yes, there is that. But I mean, again, the other thing is to be open to somebody showing up, and even if it seems to you that what that person is saying may not be the best idea, at least keeping enough of an open mind to once in a while say, hey, you know what, I'm going to try this idea. And be okay to, if it does turn out to be a good idea, give the person credit, and also, say, well, I was wrong. I thought this X idea was a terrible one. Turns out it's the best thing I heard in 6 months or whatever. And but I would think that anybody who is in any kind of teaching profession and that has a bit of a vocation, that would be a part of the appeal. I would hope, at least, because otherwise we're doomed.
That's a good way to wrap it up. I know we're a little behind time-wise. Do you have a couple extra minutes for us to do off-topic and some questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So in that case, let's go ahead to the off-topic. For anybody who has not listened to The Switch before, the off-topic is a quick segment we do at the end where we give our guests a chance to bring up a topic that is not directly related to the main topic. It can be tangential. It doesn't have to be serious. It can be serious, but it can really be anything. We'll spend a minute or two on it, and we'll move on to questions. So, Jean-Luc, what do you have for us?
Well, my off topic is not entirely off topic, but it has to do with the way that we integrate with technology. So, we've been talking about the fact that we are dealing with more and more with technological advances, which are more and more demanding in terms of our specialization skill set and so forth. But one topic that I think we are very happy to ignore for the time being is, at what point do we acknowledge the fact that our interaction with technology is limited by our biological envelope,
Yeah.
meaning that at what point does it make sense to get a chip inserted into your arm and say, this would be my Wi-Fi router? At what point does it make sense to say, hey, I need storage on the go? There's my storage on the go. I mean, these are very complex questions because they confront us with the very nature of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
But technology inherently confronts us with the very nature of what it means to be human, because that is one of those things that I think make us humans. I mean, we're not the only creatures in the world to use tools. We are certainly the one species that seem to have made such advanced use of our tools.
Yeah.
And, we're all on Zoom now. We are living in a strange time. There's risks of, obviously, pandemic. Travel is more difficult. And all of a sudden, almost overnight, the world is finding itself Zooming or whatever, teleconferencing.
Right.
And we all know that it's been a bit of a painful process. I think in a way it's reminded us that, yeah, we have great technology, but our technology isn't quite there to make this a seamless transition. It has been a painful transition for a lot of people, and not the least of which has been to interact with the technology. And that means, for some of us that may be more technologically advanced, there might be even fun in it. I shouldn't say advanced, I should say savvy, because that doesn't mean much. But for those of us who are technologically savvy or have an interest in technology in the first place, that might be fun. It's been fun, finding out which microphone I should use to teach, or which camera, or which service I should use, or where should I place my mic, all of these things. But ultimately, there's a lot of moving parts to this. And it is still not nearly as seamless as the kind of interaction I can have with somebody one-on-one or in a classroom, even if it's not one-on-one. There are benefits of the technology. There are drawbacks. Right now, I would think that most people are not sure. If you ask most people if the benefits outweigh the drawbacks, I'm not sure most people would say that the technology is better than the drawbacks. There's a lot there to unpack, but some of that I think ultimately will come down to how we decide to interact with technology on a very profound level. So
Sorry,
please.
I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, that's one of the topics that I think has been made very, very obvious to me in this past few months.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to become more and more of a hot sort of a flashpoint moving forward.
I think there's also a flip side to that of using technology to sort of supercharge or hack your own biology. I mean, when you first brought up the topic, the thing that I thought of was the simple ability to change the playback speed of a podcast or a YouTube video, and what that does to your ability to take in and process information, and how you can specifically dial in the rate at which you take in information to optimize whatever it is you're trying to get out of that. And that's a mode of technological interaction that has allowed us to do some adaptation, but the boundary is still there. We're still not crossing between microchips and flesh in a way that I think you meant to that topic to go, which is interesting in and of itself.
Well, the topic is so profound in terms of the implication and what it means to us. But I remember working on this piece for a private company that did a lot of fundraising for biotech. And one of the startups that they were working with was a startup that would actually that dealt with heart transplants. And their premise was the reason that we cannot create a pump that's good enough for an artificial heart to last for a very, very long time is that the physics of it are very complex.
Mm.
But do we need to do we need those elements to be there? Do we even need a pump? And that was the question these like two doctors in research from Texas pointed, and they came up with a separate alternative. Now, I don't think that it's been widely successful, and I'm sure there's a ton of NDAs around that, but not that I didn't sign any of them, so, and I don't know the details, but what fascinated me about their approach was they said, we do not need a pump, we cannot make pumps. We do not need a heartbeat. We just need to have blood flowing through the body. And why should it be done through pumps? Why can't it just continuously flow?
Mm.
And now they've done some experiments which actually yielded results on cattle and even in extreme cases on very desperate patients. But certainly there were a couple of cows in Texas that were, walking around without a heartbeat for a while. They were alive. They thrived. I mean, that's as much as you can thrive under the circumstances. But it's fulfilled its purpose. It is a machine that allowed us to extend our, in this case, life or lifespan, but that fundamentally changed what we think is the root of, sonically speaking, of life, which is a heartbeat. And these doctors kind of made that switch and say, that is actually not thinking that's helping us. It's been holding us back. And as a result, we will come up with a different approach. Now, whether or not that will become something that yields technological results and benefits for humanity, I don't know. But to me, that was one of the first time where I saw a sort of an iconoclastic view of how technology and biology could interact in a way that would probably scare a lot of people, unless you were in dire need of the technology, in which case you would probably welcome it with open arms. So that's something that has come. That reflection is an ongoing thing, obviously, and I like to muse about it. But again, I think that being in a pandemic era has made everyone, has confronted everybody with technology beyond an ATM card and checking email. And now you realize that we have become so intertwined with the technology, but we also have at the same time have such a difficult time accepting it, that there's a tension there that has to be resolved one way or another. How, I don't know, but that tension, I think, is not going to go away. I think it's going to keep growing until something is done to resolve it.
Awesome. Alex, did you want to jump in on that at all?
No, I think that's awesome.
Cool. Then we'll move on to we'll wrap up with some audience questions.
Okay.
Just a quick reminder to the audience as you ask questions, we're not going to do any follow-ups. It's try to keep your questions brief and on topic. Feel free to agree or disagree with anything you've heard so far, but please be courteous. And we will start our questions off with Joseph Bullock. You're up.
Hi, thanks, guys, and thank you, Jean-Luc, for joining us this evening. It's really been fascinating. It's been awesome. You had spoken about working with some game studios like Looking Glass Technologies. What were some of the things that, or had you ever worked with a studio that had been acquired by a bigger company? And what was lost and what was gained after the acquisition? Like, was some of the creativity lost? Was some of the passion lost? What were some of the main characteristics that changed after being acquired?
That's a very good question, actually. It's a pretty complex one. What I will say is, in my experience, and I'm certainly not a venture capitalist, so I'm really just talking from being the boots on the ground. What I've noticed is when more money was pumped into a company, the aversion for risk taking also increases at the same rate. And so, which initially I felt was counterintuitive. I imagined that, oh great, this company just bought this other company out. They're putting all this money into it. There's going to be a new life. There's going to be new technology being developed, and usually it's the opposite. Usually it's about protecting your investment. And games, to be fair, are very expensive to develop. And if you're a smaller or medium-sized game studio, you're not that far off from bankruptcy. You will need to spend so much money on R&D that if the game doesn't do well, one single game can sometimes have disastrous consequences. So I do understand why that is, or why there is some level of caution. Of course, anybody wants to be able to that invest into anything wants to protect their investment. That's just human and makes sense. But I feel like especially audio has usually been bearing the brunt of that, because new graphics are a given. They've always been a given. More colors, more resolution, more frames per second. Audio has not always been a given. And so when you're looking at the entire production process, when you're looking at ways that you can at least save money, if not save, but at least not put any more money into it, audio is a very tempting candidate to say, you know what, I'm not going to name names here because I don't want to get sued, but I've worked for studios where I've been told, hey, the last game sold millions of copies and we spent $40,000 on the soundtrack, period. Why should we spend any more on this one? And those were games that have sold tens of millions of copies at times, and those were the and it's difficult to argue with that logic when you're talking to somebody who doesn't understand the technology, because if you're talking to somebody who comes from the financial side of things, there is so much that you need to be able to explain to even justify the cost, because you have to educate them about the importance of audio. Another point, by the way, that I think the pandemic has made clear to us, it's possible to have a Zoom call with mediocre video as long as you have good audio. Try the other way around. Good luck with that. And that's one of those things where, we are, visual dominance is a thing as a human, as a species. And so, to try and tell somebody, I know you put all this money into this acquisition, but I'm going to actually ask you to take a little bit of a leap of faith, and I'm going to try to explain to you, well, we need to spend more money than you did last time to make the soundtrack better. If you're lucky, they will be receptive. If you're unlucky, they won't care, because they might as well be selling soap. They just happen to sell games, and that's where the investment is. But if you're lucky, that's not the case. But even then, it's tricky, and I think that's why, to be fair, audio as technology has lagged as much as it has compared to other technologies. It's because I feel like every time a company gets, or it's part of it, every time a company gets taken over by another one, well, where can we save some money? Great, audio. And that's been a little bit problematic, I think. I think VR is the only thing, like virtual reality is the one technology that's made that clear. If you're gonna have people, look around in 360, walk around and touch objects and move them, then the sound has to follow. And that's why we've seen, Facebook and Google and other large companies that had otherwise very little interest in sound started to have research or buy audio research divisions, like Facebook did with Oculus, like Google did with their Resonance. Microsoft was never fully a foreigner in the game audio side of things, but they've definitely upped the ante after VR. These are not companies that we think of as audio innovators, and I'm pretty positive that Facebook did not invest in Oculus because they just felt like they needed better sound effects for their websites. So that might be changing, and I hope it is. But that can certainly be that's one of the things that, again, boots on the ground. I have noticed that being a problem.
Next up is Ed, and thank you for the question, Joseph.
Yeah, Jean-Luc, I'm very much impressed by your depth of knowledge, and it was a terrific presentation.
Thank you.
As an older guy who grew up with Pong, that was my first foray into the field. Um, to see the technology that has developed since the 70s is just amazing. Just as a layman who's a bystander, it's just incredible. But I wanted to just ask you what you think would be the next major breakthrough in interactive technology, something that will really be, kind of landmark, that will, really excite us all.
Um, that is quite a question, and with hindsight, of course, we can sort of look back and say this piece of technology was a landmark. Like, I can say what the Atari 2600 and the Nintendo Super NES, the first Xbox, the PlayStation, of these were this technology that involved. What I think we're going to see, honestly, is not so much per se new technologies, because when you look at the technology that we use in VR now, for instance, even on the higher levels, they actually had been around with us for quite some time. Meaning, doing 3D sound on headphones, that started to happen in the 80s with NASA. Doing 360 recordings that we now call ambisonic recording. That's been around since the 1970s, early 1970s. VR headsets, they were around in the mid 80s. But what we're seeing, I think, is the technologies are maturing, and we're starting to see more interest in them. So I suspect that it is the integration of these technologies in a more and more practical way that will make this the next bit of sort of product that will be the next big thing. Now, that's if you're thinking about it from the standpoint of like, yeah, this was a PlayStation 1. Isn't that an amazing bit of technology? Or this was the first, VR headset, that the HTC Vive. Well, that was a big game changer. But the next thing, I think, and that goes way beyond gaming, is going to be AI and big data. And I think that the integration of AI and big data in games is going to actually revolutionize the industry. Not just gaming, for that matter. But I think that with actual AI that is not, that goes beyond the stuff that we're used to, where, the AI character in the games kind of follow you around and they may be more or less smart, but, you still have to like essentially train them, like, hey, you can go through this path or that path or that path, but if you don't show them the ways to get from point A to point B, they might not get there because they will just, turn around and sort of like walk around in a room in circles forever, which is the current state of AI for the matter. Like, AI is fairly limited as it applies to games. That I think we're going to see becoming more and more prevalent. But beyond that, I think it's actually what we're going to see of gaming technology being applied outside of gaming. That's genuinely going to change the world. Meaning, if you look at, I remember that maybe like about 2007, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force were hiring a ton of people that knew how to program the Unreal 3 engine. Now, that's not because they wanted to make games, although they did. The U.S. Army actually made a game at the time. That was a recruitment tool. It's because they were developing AI technology for drones with off-the-shelf tools. In fact, at the time, and I suspect there still is, I'm not as involved. I was never fully involved with it, but I'm not as connected to that aspect of it that I was. Unreal, which makes a very popular game engine, a game engine that's been used to make things like Gears of War, among others. Fortnite might be the latest game that's very popular. They have a military version of their game engine, which is not for distribution. And I feel like seeing how these tools are increasingly making our way into non-gaming applications, that's going to be the real revolution. That would almost be something that I think most of us might not see coming until it's here. and that we will not use these tools for entertainment anymore. They will just be communication tools. You know, like we're talking about the limitation of Zooms. Zoom is great, don't get me wrong. I really like being able to interact with Zoom. There's been a number of attempts to make technologies like Zoom work in VR environment, where people have avatars that they can walk around and interact with people in the 3D space. And these have been very limited in their scope and in their success. Once they stop being limited in scope and success, that's where I think that it will be very difficult to predict what happens next. You know, I always feel like we have about a 10 to 15-year window where we can sort of say, this is going to happen, we think. This is going to happen, maybe. Past that window, it starts to become an event horizon where it becomes impossible to determine the implication of the technology that we haven't yet invented. So I think that we're going to see two things. One is better integration of the existing tools that we currently have. That probably should have been developed a long time ago, but that weren't for any reason or other. CPUs were too slow. RAM was too expensive. Hard drives were too slow. And on the other hand, so these technologies we're starting to see now, that's where we see VR, that's actually pretty decent these days. It's not perfect, but it's getting much, much, much better with every iteration. And then maybe the less obvious but more prevalent way, I think it's going to be that these technologies are no longer going to be used for gaming. I think you're going to use these technologies when you go to the doctor, when you want to buy an apartment, when you want to rent an apartment, when you want to meet people. And that I think, I don't want to use the word insidious because that implies a negative connotation. But I think it will be much harder to sort of detect when we kind of went past the point where there was no recovery, where there was no way we could put these technologies back, and we know we're dependent on those. That makes sense.
All right. Thank you. We will take one last question from Izzy. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you. That was really great. You kind of just answered a lot of my question in a way, but I'll just throw it at you anyway. It seems to me like you're interested also in like the social and cultural and biological implications and impacts of all this technology, the VR, the AI. So I'm curious, like, if you know about cyborg anthropology, if you're interested in that, and where you stand kind of personally on the implications of this technology getting more prevalent just in our society beyond entertainment.
So I haven't studied the topic from the standpoint of cyborg anthropology, just to be clear. So that is not an area that I would say that falls into my umbrella of expertise. However, I feel like I've skirted around it a lot in my life. Let's just put it this way. I feel like it's a bit of an existential question for the planet, to be honest. And I can see it. I'd like to be optimistic about it, and say that what these technologies can bring us is the ability to make the differences between people less obvious and the commonalities more so. And in doing so, hopefully, making us all feel more connected to each other. Something that I think everybody would agree would be a good thing these days. And I think that no matter where you stand on the political side, which I'm not interested in discussing, but that would be a positive thing. I also feel that if we are not careful at monitoring these technologies, the potential for the exact opposite is very high. You know, I can see how these technologies are very expensive. How making them available to some and not all could ultimately have a much more detrimental effect on the whole than not. I'm hoping, however, that ultimately what will happen is that we as a species will come to some kind of realization, and that realization will be that it's going to be difficult to continue being as we are, let's just say mostly biological beings, because I mean, I have a bridge, and some of us have, metal in lieu of bones. Some of us have pacemakers. There's many ways I mean, I have glasses. That's not part of biology, and we're all okay with that. Now, that seems like a given. In fact, it would seem cruel not to give a child glasses and need glasses. It would be cruel. You wouldn't say, like, no, that is not part of your biology. This is, I mean, I suppose, if some people might, but hopefully they're a very, very tiny minority, right? So I feel like these things are going to happen. How they happen, if there's no conversation for it, I feel like it could happen in a very piecemeal way that could be detrimental. That is one area where I can actually say I'm genuinely displeased with our political leadership as a whole, which is that these technological issues are not addressed by anyone, or hardly ever. And we're kind of pretending like it's not there, maybe because there's other things that obviously need our attention, but this is becoming past the point where it's just, I mean, like, if people felt that going to the moon was perhaps, frivolous, they may have, I disagree with that point, but they may have had a point. They may have had a leg to stand on. I don't think that anybody would say now that, having a conversation of how technology will integrate with biology is a frivolous topic. It's only gonna get, technology is gonna stop for us. We're not gonna stop things. In fact, as a matter of fact, soon we will not be creating technology. Technology that we created will create more technology for us to use. So, we're going to have to be able to interface with whatever these new technologies are, unless we all of a sudden decide that, we want to go back to 19th century lifestyle. And I don't think that for most of us, that's an option. But I would hope that, and this is where, I'd like to think that, the generation that comes after me would do things that my generation failed to do, to be fair. So, sorry. But that would be to take ownership of this issue. And to realize that we've been, for any number of reasons, some of which I think are very human, the fear of massive change, and we're talking about changing within our very flesh. That's probably our most ultimate prized possession is our health and our bodies. But if we don't have that conversation, we're not going to be in control of these changes. That opens a lot of doors that could be very unpleasant as a whole. And this is where I feel like maybe things like gaming actually start to have a much more serious impact. What may have seemed like, a way to keep your 8-year-old, that was me, entertained in 1982 because, well, 84, but because you just kind of, had other things to do, and that understandably so, your, both parents are working, and here's an Atari thing, I think you like this, and yeah, I love it, thank you, I'll never bother you for the next 2 hours now. But then you realize that that was just literally just the very, very beginning of this journey. So I hope that more people can have this conversation. At this point in my life, I almost feel like my generation can certainly offer a little bit of perspective and guidance, but I don't think we own that conversation. I think that conversation really is owned by the people that come after me, for obvious reasons. They will be severely and much more directly impacted. I might get a chip implanted at some point. I might get a bionic eye implant because I'm going to get tired of glasses and I want to have bifocals because they suck. They genuinely suck. And so maybe someday we'll say, hey, just this implant, I can take care of it. And I think at this point in my life, I'd be like, great, sign me up. But the real changes, the changes that mean like lasting biological changes that may need that, when you're born, we need to kind of, make adjustments so you can interface. Those are not really my generation's question. We have a say in it, but I feel like it's the generation after me that really has the most stakes in it. So hopefully more people are willing to put that on the foreground the foreground of the political debate as well, because it's imperative, I think. So I got a little passionate there as well.
No, that's great. This has been an awesome discussion. Jean-Luc, thank you so much. For the audience, stick around after we wrap up. There will be some breakout discussions. Jean-Luc, if people are interested in following up with you or following some of your work or finding any of the things that we've talked about today, where can they find you? Do you want to plug any social media, websites, things like that? I know the book we didn't even get to talk about.
Yeah, I forgot. I wrote a book recently. It came out last month. Right, I forgot to plug it.
We showed it once, but that was the
my
CD
editor
thing.
would be so disappointed. Oh yeah, so all right. Well, actually, if you just there aren't many Jean-Luc Sinclairs around, as it turns out. So if you just Google my name, you'll find me on Instagram at JLSinclair808, but you can just look for Jean-Luc Sinclair and you'll find me on Instagram. I sometimes go on Facebook too and pop in and out on occasion. And I also have, when I'm not teaching or musing, I like to write music. I score films or actually write music that doesn't need to be scored to games or movies. And so you can find some of my work there. Obviously, I do have a website which I'm reluctant to plug because I never use it. So, but it's there, and I should probably do something with that. And the website has the hyphen in it, and that's really because a Japanese hair removal company bought my name and turned it into their domain name. And so for the longest time, if you just Googled me, this was the landing page for a Japanese beauty product, specifically hair removal, which I thought was actually kind of hilarious. So I just, instead of finding it, I felt, I just used the hyphen. People hopefully will see the humor in it. So Instagram, Facebook, website, through Berklee, through NYU, and the book, of course.
Well, I will link all of that in the show notes for the podcast and the YouTube versions of this. Any closing thoughts?
So many, but at this point, I'm just going to say I'm grateful to be able to have this conversation. I feel like the topic of interactive adaptive audio don't get a whole lot of coverage. So thank you, Chase. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Shikran, for giving us all the opportunity to have this conversation and all of the many implications I think that the technology has.
All right. Thank you, Jean-Luc. And that wraps it up. I do have a question.
Yes, please.
Is that a CR78 behind you? That. For anyone who doesn't know.
This is a, sorry, it's a little bit. Yeah, the drum machine here is a Roland CR78. It's probably about 45 years old at this point. Anybody into hip-hop that may know the TR-808 Roland drum machine, familiar for the hip-hop kick drums that it made familiar with, this is the drum machine that preceded it. So it is indeed a working CR78 drum machine. Good eye.